They marked her with shame, branded her with red, and left her to live in silence. But in the heart of the forest, she found something they could never take, her strength. Welcome to a hidden chapter of Hester Prynne's journey, a story of grace, defiance, and healing, woven in the shadows of the Scarlet Letter. If you love emotional storytelling and literary reimaginings, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. It was upon a morning sharp with the brine-scented wind from the bay, when Hester Prynne, seated by the narrow window of her thatched and lonely cottage, beheld the approach of a figure she had not expected to see again in this life. The woman, gaunt and bent with years, moved along the footpath like a shadow that clung to the frost-bitten earth, her frame wrapped in gray woolen layers and her bonnet drooping low, as if ashamed to behold the face it partially veiled. Hester rose and opened the door ere the knock had sounded. "Goodwife Sims," she said with mild surprise, "what wind carries thee from thy hearth to mine?" The old woman glanced upward, revealing a face creased like withered parchment, her eyes rimmed with pink from weeping and smoke. "Mistress Prynne," she croaked, her voice hoarse with age and perhaps guilt, "I would not have come, but for dire need. My boy Thomias, he burns with a fever not of this world. He writhes and mutters as one bewitched." Hester, ever still of visage, gave no sign of reproach. Yet within her heart stirred a memory of this same woman. 5 winters passed, spitting upon the ground where Hester's shadow had fallen, and whispering slanders to the baker's wife. "I am no witch, good wife," Hester said calmly, "and yet thou comest to me, rather than the goodly matron with her book of prayers?" The old woman's eyes faltered. "Aye," she said after a moment's struggle, "for though the parson's wife brings piety, 'tis thou who bringest salves. Thy hands have eased the pains of many, though their lips deny it." A breath of wind stirred Hester's hair, lifting a dark strand across the letter stitched upon her breast. She did not brush it away. "I shall come," said Hester. "Give me but a moment to gather what is needful." A silence fell between them, thick with unspoken reckonings. As Hester turned to fetch her satchel, she heard the old woman whisper behind her, not to Hester, but to the wind, perhaps to her own soul. "I judged thee once with the eyes of the town. Now I beg thee with the heart of a mother." And though Hester made no reply, her hand tightened upon the strap of her worn bag, and her brow furrowed, not from offense, but from the weight of grace. Before the sun had yet risen in full over the clustered rooftops of Boston, Hester stepped from her cottage, the door latching softly behind her as though it, too, bore the habit of silence. Pearl, still drowsy with sleep, had been left in the care of Mistress Dudley, a woman more stern than kind, but not ungentle where children were concerned. Hester had offered no explanation, and Mistress Dudley had asked none. There existed in the town a reluctant acknowledgment that when Hester Prynne moved beyond her dwelling, it was with purpose few dared interrupt. The forest stood some distance to the west, its edge shrouded in morning mist, like the hem of a widow's veil. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and Hester's footsteps fell soundless on the moss and broken twigs beneath. Her fingers clutched the strap of her satchel, which held an assortment of herbs, angelica root, boneset, and the balm she had fashioned from rabbit tobacco and lard. Beneath these lay the folded linen she had embroidered not for coin, but for the comfort of the dying. As she passed the last field before the trees swallowed the road, she glanced once over her shoulder. The town, such as it was, crouched beneath a sky tinged blue and ash. Its spire pointed heavenward, as if in accusation. "A city of saints," she murmured aloud. "But its saints have teeth." And then she walked on, the Scarlet Letter at her bosom flashing once in the dappled light, as though even the sun marked her with recognition. The trees grew thicker, taller, more ancient. The road vanished altogether, replaced by a narrow trail, half swallowed by the underbrush. Yet Hester pressed forward with no hesitation. She had come here before, on errands of mercy, on walks of sorrow, and once, long ago, to cry where none could hear her. She recalled that day with sudden clarity, the tears that would not cease, the name she had whispered to the trees, as though they could carry it to the ear of one who dared not answer. Her thoughts turned inward. I have walked in shame, yes, but not in cowardice. My steps have always pressed forward, never back. The forest grew still as if it listened. She paused to rest by a tree whose roots curled from the ground like the fingers of a buried giant. A squirrel chittered somewhere above, and a crow called twice in the distance. Then, as she rose to walk on, her lips parted with a quiet thought, one that surprised even her. There is no path, and yet I walk. The deeper Hester walked into the forest, the more distant Boston became, not merely in space, but in soul. Here, beneath the ancient canopy where the light filtered in green and gold, the heavy scaffolding of the town's judgment seemed to dissolve into something older, something untouched by magistrates or ministers. The trees did not bear witness, and the earth did not condemn. Yet the silence pressed close, not as a comfort but as a mirror. It reflected back to her the long shadows of her own memory, shadows which no measure of good deed or herbal salve could banish. She remembered the first time she had passed this very trail years ago, when the scarlet letter was still new and her shame fresh as blood upon linen. Her child had been yet an infant then, and the burden of her secret had bowed her shoulders more than the infant's weight. He had not come for her. She had stood among the trees on that distant day, watching the road, heart leaping at every footfall that proved to be a stranger's. The leaves had rustled with the sound of his name, though he never spoke it. Her footsteps slowed. Was I so naive to think love could brave the scaffold? That his conscience would surrender to his heart? The pain, dulled by years of endurance, flickered anew, not with heat, but with the ache of something long frostbitten. If thou hadst stood beside me, she murmured aloud, we might have borne the shame together and found it the lighter for it. But instead, she halted suddenly, as though some unseen force had cut her speech short. A wind passed through the branches, and with it, the soft hiss of leaves brushing one another like conspirators. Hester tilted her face to the breeze and closed her eyes. No, she whispered. There is no use in speaking to the trees. They have heard enough secrets, and kept them better than men. The trail turned, and she followed, the hem of her coarse gown catching against brambles that clutched at her like grasping hands. She tugged it free, unflinching, and walked on. A deer darted across her path and vanished into the thicket. Hester paused, watching the place where it had disappeared. It runs for no reason but its nature. It hides not from shame. Perhaps I, too, shall learn to run without fear. Not from the past, but through it. The silence thickened again, but now it seemed less accusatory, more companionable. A silence that had walked alongside her for years, yet only now began to resemble solitude, not isolation. She drew her shawl tighter and stepped forward, heart beating evenly with each footfall. Midway through the day, when the sun had risen to its zenith but scarcely breached the dense canopy above, Hester found herself in a pocket of quiet more profound than any she had yet passed. The trees here were taller, older, their bark gnarled with time and shadowed by moss. The path beneath her feet gave way to soft pine needles, and all around rose the scent of sap and resin. She halted, sensing she was not alone. A figure emerged from between two towering trunks, a woman broad-shouldered and wrapped in a hide cloak of ruddy brown. Her black hair was streaked with silver, braided tight against her skull, and her face, though worn by wind and age, held the composure of one who fears neither man nor spirit. They regarded one another in silence. At length, the woman spoke in slow English, her accent shaped by another tongue. You are the marked woman, the one the townsfolk name which, though they come to you when their own prayers fail. Hester inclined her head. So they do. The stranger stepped closer, her movements smooth as flowing water. She did not reach for Hester, nor avert her gaze. I am a Wanty. I knew the one they hanged, Mistress Hibbins. She wandered here often, spoke of voices in the wind and a beast in the dark. I knew her, too, Hester said carefully, but not well enough to speak for her soul. Awanti's eyes narrowed. None speak for another's soul, but I saw you and thought, here is a woman who listens to the trees, not to the bells of Boston. A dry smile touched Hester's lips. The bells never rang for me. I hear better without them. Awanti nodded slowly, then reached into a pouch at her side and drew forth a bundle wrapped in birch bark. This is from the black ash near the marsh. Steep it when the fever takes hold and the child moans in his sleep. It cools the fire without killing the dreams. Hester accepted the bundle without question. I thank you. Awanti turned her face skyward, where the sunlight filtered down in soft spears. You walk not only through the wood, but through your own trial. I see the burden, red like blood on your chest, and red like fire in your spirit. Hester's hand rose unconsciously to the scarlet letter. It is both curse and shield. They meant to break me with it, but it has instead sewn me whole. The woman grunted with quiet approval. Then you are wiser than most who wear no mark. They stood thus for a moment, two women shaped by silence, shadow, and solitude. Then Awanti stepped back into the trees. Grow where they say nothing can, she said. That is the way of the wild rose. And she was gone. Hester looked down at the birch-wrapped bark in her hand, then upward at the sky barely seen through the pine. Grow where nothing can, she repeated to herself, and for the first time that day her breath came a little easier. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin, and a clearing appeared beyond a copse of birches where smoke curled upward from a stone chimney. The cottage stood like a relic carved from the land itself, its wooden frame moss-covered, its windows dimmed by age and sorrow. Hester approached with a steady pace, though her body bore the fatigue of the journey and her hands, reddened by cold, clutched the satchel more tightly than before. The door creaked open before she could raise her hand to knock. Goodwife Sims stood upon the threshold, her figure sagging as though the grief within had leached the strength from her bones. Her eyes were hollow, her lips trembling without speech. He grows worse, she said at last, moving aside. The boy cries out for his father, though that man lies cold these 5 winters. Fever's taken his wits. Hester stepped in without ceremony. The interior was dim, save for the hearth's flickering glow. A small cot stood beside it, upon which lay a boy of perhaps 10, his limbs restless, his brow damp with sweat, and his lips murmuring some broken litany. She knelt beside him at once, placing the back of her hand against his cheek, then gently unfastened her satchel. I shall brew the bark into a draught, she said, voice low and sure, and steep the balm upon his chest. It may not rest the fever by nightfall, but come dawn, he shall breathe easier. The widow's voice trembled behind her. You have no cause to help me. I shunned you, spat at your path, called you consort to the devil. Hester paused, her fingers steadying a small iron pot over the hearth. She did not turn to look at the woman but let the moment settle between them like ashes falling. And yet you opened your door to me today, she said softly. Perhaps that is atonement enough for both of us. The older woman stifled a sob. I cannot forgive myself for how I judged thee. Then do not, Hester answered, but let the boy live, and love him better for the pain you carry. The boy stirred and whimpered. Hester reached into her pouch and crushed a leaf between her fingers, releasing a clean scent of mint and something older, almost bitter. She turned to the woman, whose hands twisted in the folds of her apron. Sit beside him, Hester instructed gently. Hold his hand. Let him hear your voice, not the rustling of death. The widow obeyed, kneeling, her cracked hands clutching the boy's slender fingers as though they were reeds in a flood. Hester busied herself with the preparation, the firelight playing across her face and the scarlet letter like a brand made holy. She did not speak again, nor did she need to. In her stillness, she carried the weight of judgment and the balm of grace, each indistinguishable from the other. Outside, the wind shifted. A single rose petal, long withered, blew against the window pane and clung there, trembling but unfallen. The boy, Thomias, had fallen into a deep, sweat-drenched sleep by nightfall. His brow, though still warm, no longer burned with the unnatural heat of the fever. Hester sat silently beside the hearth, her shawl pulled tight about her shoulders. The widow, Goodwife Sims, sat across from her, her eyes fixed on the embers, though her thoughts clearly wandered further than the firelight reached. Outside, the wind moaned softly through the trees like a voice long denied speech. Within, only the crackle of flame and the occasional pop of sapwood disturbed the hush. After a long silence, the old woman spoke. "They say the forest holds spirits," she murmured, half to herself, "that they walk between the trunks by moonlight, whispering to the roots and stones." Hester, resting her palms on her lap, answered with quiet gravity, "Perhaps they do, and perhaps the spirits bear less malice than men with their sermons and stocks." The widow looked up sharply, her lip twitching as though she meant to argue. But then she softened, sighing as her eyes found the child again. "I knew the town before it wore piety like armor," she said. "There was a time when mercy outweighed punishment, when ministers were shepherds, not butchers of the soul." Hester listened, the flames reflected in her dark eyes. The old woman leaned closer to the fire, her voice a rasp. "You were not the first to wear shame, Mistress Prynne. I have seen men, elders, mind you, who walked upright on Sunday, but crept through shadows come the Sabbath's end. One, he lies now in the churchyard, had a child by a servant girl, then drove her mad with silence. She wandered into the marsh, singing hymns to the reeds." A hush followed, broken only by the hiss of sap in the fire. Hester spoke gently. "And what did the town say of her? That she was possessed." The woman spat bitterly. "That her laughter was the devil's echo. They bound her with ropes and drowned her in holy water." Hester closed her eyes, lips pressed tightly together. The memory of her own scaffold came unbidden. The thousand eyes, the shame-made spectacle. The widow leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Do you not see? The letter they sewed upon you, they would sew it upon every soul, if they could. But they pick only those who do not kneel quickly enough." A silence, heavy with recognition, settled between them. Then Hester said, low and firm, "And yet we live." The widow nodded slowly. "Aye, and some learn to see in the dark, while others are blinded by the light." A log crumbled in the hearth. The fire flared, casting tall shadows that danced across the low rafters. Hester rose and walked to the boy's bedside. She adjusted the damp cloth upon his brow, watching the slow, steady rise of his breath. "Let the town keep its saints," she whispered. "I shall walk with the broken and the bound." Behind her, the widow bowed her head, not in shame, but in reverence. The moon had risen, full and pale, casting a ghostly sheen over the clearing. Within the cottage all was still. The boy, wrapped in sleep's fragile embrace, no longer murmured. The widow slumbered in her chair, one hand still curled protectively upon the cot's edge. Only Hester remained wakeful, her dark eyes fixed upon the dying embers. But some unrest stirred within her. Not fear nor dread, but an old unease that clung to her as the letter clung to her breast. She stepped softly to the door and unlatched it. A breeze met her, cool and scented with pine and damp leaves. She stepped out into the hush. Above her, the sky stretched wide, unbroken but for the whispering crowns of trees. The world glowed with that silvery hue that makes all things beautiful, yet strange. She walked a little way from the cottage, her feet soundless upon the moss. The forest pulsed with stillness, not empty, but watching. Then she saw her. Between two leaning firs, bathed in moonlight, stood a figure draped in black. Her garments clung like shadows, and though her back was turned, Hester knew the shape. The bearing was unmistakable. "Mistress Hibbins," she breathed, though the name scarcely passed her lips. The figure did not move. She stood utterly still, like a carving in alabaster, elegant and mournful. Her silver hair shone faintly beneath her hood, and her hand, thin and pale, rested upon the bark of the tree as though listening to its secrets. Hester's heart beat louder in her ears. She stepped forward, but no twig cracked, no leaf stirred. "Speak," Hester said, her voice quiet yet resolute. "If you are spirit, then be not silent. If you are woman, tell me why you wander still." The The figure slowly turned her head, not fully, but just enough to reveal the pale curve of her cheek and the glint of an eye dark as a raven's wing. But no words came. Instead, she raised her hand, not to beckon, but to point. Her finger extended toward the trees deeper still, where the light failed and the forest grew wildest. Then, as though drawn back into shadow, the woman moved, faded, into the mist, her form dissipating like breath upon glass. Hester stood rooted, her hand pressed to her chest, not in fear, but in wonder. Was it memory, moonlight trickery, or something summoned by her own buried longing for understanding? She turned back to the cottage, her breath visible in the cold air. "Know which was she," Hester murmured. "But a mirror of what the town fears, a woman unbound." The door creaked softly as she re-entered. All within lay as she had left it. The boy stirred once and sighed. Hester sat again by the hearth, but sleep would not come. She watched the last coal die and, in the silence, felt not haunted but strangely whole. The hush of dawn had not yet broken when Hester rose from her seat by the hearth, her limbs stiff from stillness, her spirit yet stirred by the vision of the night before. The boy slept more soundly now, color returning faintly to his cheeks. The widow slumbered, head bowed in exhausted reprieve. All around lay that sacred pause before morning, where time held its breath between shadow and sun. Hester moved to the small table near the window. There, she found a sliver of tallow candle, half-burned, and a bit of parchment yellowed with age. Beside it lay a dull quill dry with disuse. She did not know what impulse guided her hands, only that something within, long stifled, sought release. She lit the candle and seated herself, the scarlet letter casting a faint hue upon the wood. Then she began to write. "To thee, who knowest thy name though I dare not speak it. There are nights when I think of what might have been, and the thought is not bitter, but hollow, a space unfilled. I have long ceased to curse thy silence. The world has done so in thy place. Yet even still my heart remembers, not as a fool, but as a woman who once loved in truth. I do not write to draw thee from thy station, nor to beckon thee from thy pulpit. I write because the forest has shown me its silence, and I find it less cruel than thine. Hadst thou stood with me, we might have faced the scaffold with joined hands. But I bore it alone, and found my footing where none believed I could. The letter they sewed upon me has grown into flesh. I do not ask thee to wear it, but to know that it has not undone me. Pearl is strong. She does not yet know what binds us all, but I fear the day she will. I pray thou wilt find the courage to meet her eyes when that day comes. I forgive thee, not because I am saintly, but because hatred is a chain I cannot afford to wear." She paused. The quill hovered above the parchment, ink nearly spent. Then, as though completing a final confession, she wrote, "I loved thee. I do not repent it." She set the quill aside. The candle flickered as the wind found its way through the chinks in the wall. For a long while, she stared at the letter, the words bleeding into the paper like wounds into cloth. Then, with no flourish, no sentiment, she folded it once and fed it into the fire. The flames caught quickly, devouring the paper as though eager to claim its truth. Hester watched until it was nothing but curling ash, then whispered, "So be it." Behind her, the child stirred in his sleep. Outside, a faint light crept into the sky, and within her chest, where once sorrow had nestled, there now grew the small, sure root of peace, not blooming yet, but alive. With morning full upon the land, Hester gathered her things with quiet purpose. The child had taken broth without protest, and his eyes, though rimmed with weariness, held the brightness of returning strength. The fever, for now, had loosened its cruel grip. Goodwife Sims wept when Hester placed a cool hand upon her shoulder. "He would have gone to join his father," the widow said, her voice trembling like the morning leaves. "But thou hast turned his face back toward life." Hester, already wrapping her shawl, replied softly, "No hand can call the soul back, save it wills to return. The boy chose to remain. I merely kept the door open." The widow bowed her head. I shall speak thy name in blessing now, not in fear. Hester offered no answer. The heart finds no nourishment in praise that comes too late, nor does it hunger for it. She stepped outside, and the sun, dappled by the leaves, warmed her face. For the first time in days she let it. At the edge of the clearing, where path met wilderness once more, a figure waited. Awanti stood leaning on a gnarled staff carved with crude markings. Her eyes, deep as the forest floor, searched Hester's face. You return changed, she said, not as a question, but as a truth seen from afar. Hester nodded once. The path gives what the town withholds. Awanti reached into her cloak and withdrew a single bloom. A wild rose, its petals open and bold, its stem torn free from bramble. Take this, she said, not as charm nor token but reminder. Some flowers grow where no gardener has dared to sow. Hester received the blossom with care. Its scent was faint, almost imperceptible, but not without sweetness. I thank you, she said. You have given me more than bark and blossom. The woman gave a nod like the bowing of pine in wind. You walk alone, but you are not the only one who does. Then, as before, she slipped between the trees, vanishing without sound or sign. Hester stood a moment longer, the rose in hand, and then turned eastward, toward the settlement, the sea, and the life she had not chosen but had made her own. The trail back was familiar, but it no longer felt burdened. Her steps were weary, but not from heaviness. She moved like one who carries her shame not as a chain, but as a flame sheltered close. Painful, yes, but hers. She paused once, mid-journey, to drink from a stream that trickled between stones. As she knelt, the wind lifted her shawl and with it the letter on her breast, which flashed red against the green of earth and leaf. No eyes beheld it there but the trees, and they did not judge. It was near to mid-morning when Hester stepped once more into the margin where forest gave way to field, and field, in turn, yielded to the rutted road that curved back toward Boston. The sun now lay broad upon the land, casting the world in a light too stark for illusions, yet Hester's heart bore an ease uncommon to her station. The wild rose, tucked discreetly within the folds of her satchel, remained unwithered, its presence small but strangely consoling. As she approached a bend in the road, the sound of approaching hooves broke the quiet. A merchant on horseback, cloaked in sable and bearing a satchel of goods slung across his saddle, pulled to a halt upon sighting her. His horse pawed the dirt nervously, as though mistrust passed from rider to beast. The man narrowed his eyes, surveying Hester with the careless boldness of one who had never stood upon a scaffold. "Ho there," he said, with a smirk twisting his lips. "What fortune leads Mistress Hester Prynne from her den of solitude? Doth the scarlet letter now wander freely, like a tale on every tongue?" Hester did not flinch. She met his gaze with the calmness of one long acquainted with such barbs. "I go where mercy calls," she replied evenly, "and return by the same road." The merchant laughed, a short, mirthless sound. "Mercy? The town calls it something else when women walk alone through the trees with satchels and secrets. But no matter. The good people will be pleased to know you've been seen again, whole in flesh, if not in soul." He made as if to pass, but Hester stepped slightly aside, offering no deference. "I have no care for their pleasure," she said, voice firm but without heat. "They have shaped my shame into fable, yet I live. The letter they gave me was meant to wound, but it has become my skin." The man's expression shifted, uncertain whether to scorn or to fear. "Strange words, mistress. Truth often sounds strange to ears dulled by comfort," she answered. "Now go your way. Mine lies not through your judgment." He urged his horse forward with a grunt, and dust rose behind him as he vanished down the road. Hester stood in the wake of it, her shawl fluttering at the hem. A moment later, she continued onward. The town steeple was now faintly visible on the horizon, sharp and pale against the sky, but she did not hasten her pace. Each step carried with it the echo of Awanti's words. "Grow where they say nothing can. She passed a tree by the roadside where someone had carved a crude cross into the bark. Hester paused, touched it lightly. "Let them carve symbols," she murmured. "Mine lives and breathes." And on she walked, the scarlet letter neither burning nor burdening her now, but warming faintly as if alive. By the time Hester reached the edge of Boston, the shadows had shortened, and the air was thick with the mingled smells of sea brine and chimney smoke. The town stirred with the rhythms of daily life, buckets drawn from wells, shutters creaking open, voices calling across narrow lanes. And yet, as always, those same voices faltered when Hester passed. She walked on, head unbowed, the rose still hidden in her satchel, its petals intact though her feet were sore from the journey. At last, she arrived at the small, weather-beaten cottage near the edge of the settlement where she had left Pearl. The door swung open before her hand touched it, and there stood the child, eyes bright with something too keen for her years, dark hair falling wild across her brow. "Mother!" cried Pearl, rushing forward. "I watched the sun rise and thought you had gone to the moon." Hester knelt and caught her in a close embrace, feeling the sharp, sweet weight of her daughter's presence against her chest. "I went no further than the trees, little bird," she said, brushing a curl from Pearl's cheek. "But the forest was long, and full of voices." Pearl leaned back slightly, her small face solemn. "Did the trees speak thy name, mother? Did they whisper it with the wind like the others do?" Hester paused, her eyes lingering on the child's curious gaze. So innocent, yet laced with the shadowy understanding of one who had always lived just beyond the threshold of acceptance. "They spoke many names," she replied slowly, "and mine was but one of them. The trees do not care what letter one wears upon her breast." Pearl's gaze dropped to the red symbol, vivid as ever against her mother's dark gown. "But the people care," Pearl said, frowning slightly. "Mistress Dudley said they always will. She said your letter is stitched too deep to ever be unpicked." Hester rose, taking Pearl's small hand in hers. "There are stitches no needle can undo, 'tis true, but the meaning of the thread, that may change." She led the child inside. The hearth was cold, and the room dim, yet Hester did not light a flame. She opened the satchel and drew forth the wild rose, setting it upon the windowsill where the pale morning light kissed its petals. Pearl watched in silence. "What is it for?" she asked at last. "For remembering," Hester said, her voice distant, "that beauty may grow in places deemed cursed, and that strength need not be loud to endure." Pearl tilted her head. "Will it grow?" Hester smiled faintly. "No, child, not this one, but I will." Pearl touched the rose delicately, as though it might speak. Then, after a long pause, she said, "Someday, I want a letter too." Hester bent down, her hands on Pearl's shoulders. "May it be of your choosing," she said softly, "and may you wear it with joy, not judgment." Outside, the wind rustled faintly through the eaves, carrying no voices now, only the hush of morning and the quiet breath of home. The day wore on in stillness. The townspeople bustled with their usual indifference, casting glances when Hester passed, but none dared speak. She, for her part, neither sought their eyes nor avoided them. Her errands were few and brief, bread from the baker, thread from the weaver's stall. The coin exchanged was met with the familiar pause, that moment of doubt when piety warred with necessity. Yet no hand refused her. By the time she returned to her own door, Pearl skipping just ahead, the sun had sunk low, and the sky burned with the deepening hues of evening. The child ran off to gather wildflowers near the edge of the marsh, her laughter rising like birdsong. Hester entered the cottage alone. The hearth was cold. She set aside her satchel, now empty but for a lingering trace of forest air and crushed rose petal, and knelt before the blackened grate. With practiced movements, she arranged the kindling and struck flint to steel. Sparks flew, catching on the dry twigs. Soon, a flame rose, modest, flickering, but persistent. She watched it grow. The light danced across the worn boards of the floor, across the few possessions she claimed, and at last upon the scarlet letter, which glowed faintly, its red hue deepened by the fire's reflection. Yet in that glow, there was no heat of shame, only warmth, steady and vital. Hester rose and moved to her sewing table, where lengths of linen and wool lay in careful piles. Some pieces were meant for customers, collars and cuffs, christening robes and mourning veils. But one bolt of cloth remained untouched, its edges still clean. She unrolled it. It was a deep shade of gray, not somber, but strong, a color like ash that had once been fire. She threaded her needle and, for the first time in many weeks, stitched not for another's demand, but for her own choosing. The design was plain but firm of seam. Her fingers worked quickly, and her breath was calm. Pearl returned, scattering petals on the doorstep. "Mother," she called, "I found a white flower with no thorns at all." Hester answered from within, "Then keep it, little one. Not all beauty must defend itself." The child's laugh rang out again, and Hester smiled faintly. The fire behind her burned steady now, and in its glow, the scarlet letter did not fade, but softened. It remained unchanged in form, yet altered in meaning. Not absolved, but redeemed. She set her stitching down for a moment and gazed at the flame. "They gave me a mark to bind me," she thought, "but I have made of it a mirror, and what I see there I claim as mine." And thus the woman in scarlet stitched not penance, but power. She walked into the woods wearing shame, and returned carrying power. This was the journey they never told you about. What would you do if the world only saw your worst mistake? If the story moved you, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that reawaken the classics. Until next time, walk boldly, even when marked.